The dominant political system was feudalism, where the king owned all the land but leased out portions of the land to trusted noblemen. These noblemen, the lords of the manors, were the real rulers of society. They established their own system of justice, minted their own money, and set their own taxes. In return, the lord had to serve the king, who, above everything else, was a warrior. He had to serve the royal council, pay rent, and provide the king with knights for military service when he demanded it.
Feudalism is an ism, a system, a socio-political order in which the prerogatives of the state, whether it is the right to collect taxes, whether it is administration, whether it is military services, all the activities that is associated with a sovereign state or with a sovereign authority are actually performed by a landed military aristocracy. Even in the 13th century, Europe was essentially feudal. We find that the vassals of the king continued to own important elements of public power as hereditary and legally recognized property rights. In virtue of them being, or in virtue of the fact that they were owners of a particular estate, they enjoyed certain powers. Powers which were actually a replication of the powers of the king. This division of power between the monarch and the magnate, between the royal lord and the great vassal, this was the central characteristic of feudal monarchy. An intermediate political type standing between the decentralized feudal organization or the feudal government on the one hand and the sovereign state on the other.
Slowly the king consolidated his power and the decentralized feudal system gave way to powerful monarchies with a central bureaucracy.
An absolutist monarch was very different from the feudal king. Now, by the very word absolutist monarch, we realize that all authority is in the hands of one particular person.
An absolute monarch is a king who has absolute power over his subjects' lives. The subjects included the aristocrats and sometimes the clergy.
When you look at the various characteristics of an absolutist state or an absolutist monarch, to be more precise, then you realize in what ways it was different and, may I say, progressive, or I won't say progressive, let's call it, as far as sovereign control is concerned, we find that in place of different power centers, we have an authority, a central authority. In place of a decentralized power structure, we have a centralized power structure.
Absolute monarchy puts total trust in well-bred and well-trained monarchs groomed for the role from birth. Louis XIV, a proverbial absolute monarch, had once said, "I am the state." This statement summarizes the fundamental principle of absolute monarchy, sovereignty vested on an individual.
So, the absolutist state or the new monarchy is that phenomenon in European history which is a transient phase, which is an intermediary phase between decentralized control and the emergence of the sovereign state. Between 1453 and 1559, this is the period which is associated with the evolution of the absolutist state. This balance, the balance of power between the nobility and the king, tipped in favor of the crown. Now, in place of the nobles, the king, or in a relative analysis, the king starts acquiring those prerogatives which we find he had to abandon during the feudal period, and now he had started to regain those prerogatives.
Absolutism is a form of monarchical power that is unrestrained by any other institution such as church, legislature, and the social elite.
In 1527, in the French court, a legal expert comments about Francis I, who was the ruler of France at that time. We do not wish to dispute or minimize your power. That would be sacrilege. And we know very well that you are above the laws. It is Principes Legibus Salutis in Latin, which means the prince is not bound by laws. These jurists also define the fundamental attributes of sovereignty, the power to make law. Jean Baudin, his period is 1530 to 1596, is explicit when he says sovereignty or maestas is the power to make law. So, by definition, the sovereign authority is unbound by human law. And from this we can deduce the natural corollary of this is that a person who can make laws can also unmake laws. So Baudin writes, it is the distinguishing mark of the sovereign that he cannot in any way be subject to the commands of another. For it is he who makes law for the subject, abrogates law already made. If he wants to change it, it is he who can change it, and amends obsolete law. The law which has no use, he can change that law. And the sovereign himself is not bound by any earthly laws. He is bound by divine law or by natural law.
Divine right of the king was the theological justification of absolute monarchy. The royal monarch was not only inspired by God, but was an image of God and was therefore only accountable to God.
এক্ষেত্রে রাজা মেকিয়াভেলি দ্য প্রিন্সের মানে মেকিয়াভেলি দ্য প্রিন্সে যে রাজার কল্পনা করেছেন সেই সম্রাট।
Yes. Machiavelli speaks of an absolutist king or an absolutist prince rather. Whoever it is, the monarch should have absolute power to decide about his subjects. The destiny of a state would or should stay in the hands of the monarch. And from this it naturally follows that all those powers that had gone into the hands of the various landed magnates, he would try to bring them back. He would try to take those powers away from the landed magnates. And theoretically, how would he do it? It's not that he would call one of these magnates and say, from today I divest you from all your powers. Theoretically, how would the king actually bring back to himself all those powers that he was forced to abdicate? I won't say abdicate, but give a part of his powers to his various feudal magnates. Theoretically, then he should be able to tax regularly and without consent. He doesn't need anyone's consent. He is the king. He knows what is best for his subject. So, he should be able to tax them without taking the permission of anyone. Secondly, he should have a permanent army. If you remember feudalism, then you will also remember that in feudalism there was no standing army at all. If the king so required an army, he would ask his landed magnates to furnish them with an army. But as you all know, this was a very inefficient army because it did not have a central leadership, because all the various feudal lords were actually not intent on keeping a standing army of the desired standard. They were actually those who were used to protect him and his little fiefdom. So, whenever the king needed some armed forces, an armed retinue would be given to him by these feudal lords, but of course they lacked quality, they lacked the desired power or the desired effectiveness that is required from a soldier. He should have an efficient bureaucracy. Who is going to collect the taxes? Who is going to enforce the law? It's not possible for him to do it alone. Dispense justice in every case and to every subject. Share his jurisdictional prerogatives with no one, none. His jurisdictional prerogatives are his own. Dominate the rival authorities of parliament, the estates and the church.
Some monarchs who are often depicted as absolute rulers are Louis XIII and Louis XIV of France, Ivan III and Ivan IV, and Peter the Great of Russia, Leopold I of Austria, Frederick III of Denmark, Charles XI and Charles XII of Sweden, and Frederick the Great of Prussia.
The first thing that the Renaissance monarchs did to enhance their position in the eyes of their subjects was to introduce a lot of pomp and grandeur in their office. We find that an elaborate propaganda, symbols, ceremonies was associated with the position of the king. And we find that these ceremonies were actually initiated to inspire awe in the minds of the onlookers. Those who saw him would be so overwhelmed by this the magnificence of this king that they would be forced to acknowledge his superiority. They would, of their own volition, accept him as the ruler. When they entered cities, they made a grand entry with a whole retinue of bugle players and, you know, atop very well decorated horses or something which would make an impression in the minds of the burghers who resided in the cities. And then there were tournaments and jousts which were held. Everything. There was so much of pomp and ceremony associated with the office of, or with the position of the monarch. Another interesting aspect was that the kings would invent very fanciful genealogies. They would trace their ancestry to the Trojans. Those Trojans who were associated with with the founding of the European states, and who were driven out of their own land by the Greeks. So they would trace their ancestry to the Trojans. And history writing, in fact, became very popular during this time. The Italian and the northern humanists would vie with one another to become the court historians of one monarch or the other. And they would vie with one another for these royal appointments, and they would celebrate the monarch's achievements and write eloquently about the monarch. Obviously, these were exaggerated versions, but these were court historians. And court historians always left behind exaggerated accounts of the rulers. But they would be employed consciously by these rulers so that later the people would be able to gauge their importance by reading these accounts. So they would be engaged so that posterity would know about their greatness. Not only that, we have this patronage of this new art, the new architecture. These people were associated with everything that was beautiful, with everything that was expensive, and you had these monarchs living in elaborate Roman-style villas with gardens, etc. So everything, the moment you saw the monarch, his lifestyle, the way he presented himself, you knew he was different. So this awe, this difference, which was consciously created, would of course somehow make it impossible for the people not to recognize his otherness.
In Brandenburg, Prussia, the absolute monarch called himself the first servant of the state. This modified version of absolutism was called Enlightened Absolutism.
At the top of the governmental hierarchy was the king. And he ruled with the help of his Council of Officers. Now, what is important to state out here is that his Council of Officers, let us call them the ministers, advised the king. But was it absolutely necessary for the king to abide by the advice of these Council of Officers or ministers? No. They were allowed to advise the king. It was the prerogative of the ruler to abide by that advice or not.
However, many obstacles stood in the way of absolutism. The nobles had the means to raise private armies and build fortifications. The king had to rely on these nobles to defend the nation. Lesser nobles, who had the ability to read and write, acted as a king's agents. They collected taxes, posted edicts, and administered justice.
But let's look at the local levels, the provincial level. For example, the Castilian corregidor was the officer of local government most nearly approaching the bureaucratic type. He could be called, or they could be equated with the bureaucracy. The crown appointed and paid him, prevented him from identifying himself with the local populace. He couldn't buy a house there. He could not stay there for more than 5 years. He could not mix with the local people there. So that he did not become another center of power there, so that vested interest over there was not developed. And when he would go, the king would instruct a royal council to go to that particular area, question the people of that area as to how the corregidor functioned. If you come to Tudor England, you have the justices of peace. They served the king as efficiently as the corregidors. The crown appointed them and the council supervised them closely. But the difference between these justices of peace and the corregidor was that they were not paid for the job. They were, I won't say recruited, people from affluent sections of society, people who were well off, of their own volition, voluntarily, they gave their services as justices of peace. They were actually people who were wealthy amateurs willing to serve the state. It worked very well because the state did not have to pay them. It worked very well under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But what was the problem with the justices of peace? The fact is, the weakness of this system lay in the independence of the justices of peace. They were not bound to abide by the dictates of the king. So, the moment the royal orders conflicted with their interests and convictions, we find that they disobeyed. In France, theory and practice diverged most strikingly. The principal officers of the local government were the bailies and the senator. They were equivalent terms of the same office. They had few bureaucratic characteristics. Most were recruited from the high nobility. They were generally absentee nobles. They did not reside in the locality to which they were assigned. That is, a baillie of a particular locality did not reside there. They were much more involved in doing other things. We have, they were, somehow either they were serving the court or they were serving the royal armies abroad. The real work of the administration at the local level was done by a subordinate, a lieutenant. Like the corregidor, the lieutenant was an expert. He was a university graduate, either in civil or canonical laws, that is the religious laws, usually a bourgeois, and not immediately identified with the interests of the landed aristocracy. But what is important about this, the lieutenant, is about the appointment of the lieutenants. Sometimes we see that they were appointed by the bailies without the knowledge of the king. Sometimes we see that they are appointed by the notables. Sometimes we see that 3 names are sent from the locality to the king and the king chooses one of them. But what emerges from this is that the royal prerogative of appointing officials in France does not lie totally with the king. And it was in this context of the ambiguous relationship between the king and his officers that we have to view the selling of royal offices. The most important administrative innovation of this period becomes very important in the context of this, which is the venality of royal offices. First, it was common in France and Spain in the early years of the 16th century. What does it mean? The kings were cash-strapped. They needed immediate cash. So what they did was, they sacrificed some of the control over the appointment of the financial and the judicial officers. And why did they do so? They did so in lieu of cash. So you sell offices because you are cash strapped, you get immediate cash. But in this way, you are actually again sacrificing a royal prerogative. But this has a very positive side to it also. This results in the multiplication of royal officials. These royal officials now can no longer be denied access to the fiefdom of the vassals. And we find that venality or the selling of offices actually work to the advantage of the kings, because we find that these people were actually taking the king's governance to every subject. Between 1460 and 1560, we see that because of the rapidly growing wealth of Europe and the technological innovations associated with gunpowder, we find that the European rulers were creating armies which were of a new type. It's a difference from the feudal times when the vassals were, by virtue of being vassals, had to provide military service to the king. It is no longer the case. They are paid for it and they are in the permanent service of the king. We find that another development of this period is the employment of the mercenary soldiers. One disadvantage of employing mercenary soldiers is this, that they are not associated with any state, they do not have any feelings. But another thing is, an advantage of this is that they were politically safer. Though the captains wielded authority over them, the captains were the recruiting agents of these mercenary army of the various states. But we find that the new monarchs could be assured that these infantry did not go against them. Since they employed them, they would not go against them. Whatever wars were fought, it was their prerogative. But the problem of these people was they deserted the monarchs whenever the monarchs needed them the most. Most often than not, if they didn't feel like serving a particular ruler, they left them. Though we have recruitment of new soldiers, though we have employment of mercenaries, we also have, or we also see during this period, the continuance of the soldiers that the great nobles kept. It's not that even as late as 1560, the nobles, the great nobles, had their own retinue of soldiers.
Thus, absolutism is characterized by ending of feudal partitioning, consolidation of power with the monarch, rise of state power, unification of state laws, and decrease in influence of nobility. Absolutism is a political system that marked a transition from feudalism to capitalism.